The Proxima trade hub breathed like something alive. Beneath its steel skin, steam hissed through 1,000 veins of copper. Lights blinked with rhythms too old to be random, and the floor beneath every boot step vibrated just enough to remind you that this place had never truly stopped moving. Even when the war ended. Even when the trade routes dried up. Even when the outer sectors whispered that Proxima was cursed. Commander Ryle Kane adjusted his collar as he stepped into Bay 14. The air was too hot for artificial climate control to handle and smelled faintly of ozone and oil. His boots scraped along the catwalk as he descended toward the freighter marked Calaris Prime, a bulk transport with old Terran plating and engines that looked like they'd been patched together with prayer and rust. Beside him, Lieutenant Ilara Vess moved with quiet grace. Her Astrian skin shimmered subtly under the harsh bay lights, and her expression remained unreadable, though Ryle had known her long enough to sense the tension under the surface. "You're quiet," he said, keeping his voice low. Ilara's eyes scanned the freighter's hull. This ship left the Ferrix Junction with one registered crew member, arrived here with none. Cargo logs were locked mid-flight. Missing crew, scrambled manifests, heat signatures in the storage hold that don't match cargo specs. Ryle exhaled. Classic smuggling profile. Ilara tapped her wrist console. Life signs still inside, 3 of them. Weak, small. Ryle frowned. Small? Ilara didn't answer. She was already moving. They boarded without resistance. No automated defenses, no crew. Just the silence of a vessel that had seen too much and survived just enough. Inside, the temperature dropped. The lights flickered like they resented being turned on. They reached the lower cargo bay. Rusted crates, cracked coolant lines, boxes marked as agricultural supplies. Ilara stopped. "Behind that," she said softly. Ryle moved first, shoulder pressing against metal. The crate shifted with a groan. What lay behind it wasn't a container. It was a box. Thin metal sides, no markings, no power source, but it pulsed, faint, like a heartbeat. Ilara crouched, her hand hovering just above it. Heat signature confirms. Life inside. Ryle stepped back, drew his tool blade, and pried open the latch. The hiss was soft. Then came a whimper. Inside the box were 3 children. Alien, small, thin. Eyes too large for their faces, skin faded with dehydration, fear etched into every line of their curled bodies. They didn't speak. They couldn't. Ilara reached in slowly. One of them, a girl no older than 7 standard cycles, flinched but did not pull away. Ilara touched her gently. And in that moment, Ryle saw something shift behind her eyes. Not fear. Recognition. He turned on his comm. "This is Commander Kane. We have a Code 7 breach. Child smuggling. 3 lives confirmed. No crew on board. I want the bay sealed. Now." He cut the line. Ilara looked up at him. "They're not just cargo," she said softly. "They've been conditioned. Drugged." Ryle's jaw tightened. This wasn't a smuggler's trick. This was processing. He looked at the girl again. She stared back. And in that silence, Ryle realized something simple and horrifying. These children didn't expect to be rescued. They had been waiting to disappear. And now, he would make sure they never would. The infirmary on Proxima Station was quiet, dim, and too clean for anything good to happen inside. Ryle Kane had always hated the place. The lights buzzed faintly overhead like insects stuck in glass, and every surface smelled of metal scrubbed too many times to erase the ghosts that lingered beneath it. 3 small beds had been pulled from storage and set up in the back chamber, away from prying eyes. The children lay on them now, motionless except for shallow breaths. Medical scanners hovered silently beside their forms, monitoring vitals that flickered just above critical. Ilara Vess stood beside the youngest girl, her hand gently hovering over the child's shoulder. She didn't speak. She hadn't spoken since they arrived. Her expression hadn't changed either, but Ryle could feel the pressure radiating off her like heat from a sunstone. "She hasn't blinked," Ryle said quietly. Ilara nodded. "Trauma response. Locked sensory mode. She's still seeing the inside of that box." He looked at the scans. Each child bore a faint scar behind the ear, barely visible but unmistakable. Implant ports, tracking chips, designed to deactivate autonomic systems if tampered with. They were tagged like freight, Ryle muttered. Ilara didn't answer. She didn't need to. Dr. Marin, the station medic, stepped into the room, tablet in hand. His voice was flat, worn down by years of watching people break. They've been sedated with cortical suppressors, Astrian formula, military grade, illegal outside of classified detainment units. Where in the stars did you find these kids? Docking Bay 14, Ryle said. Freighter logged as empty. Marin shook his head slowly. You know what this is, right? We know, Ilara said. Her voice was low, steady, cold. They're not just victims, Marin added. They're evidence, which means command will want them held, isolated, tagged. Ilara stepped between the beds and the medic, her stance like a blade drawn without sound. No. Ryle didn't stop her. Marin hesitated. Ilara, no one tags them again. The room fell into silence. Ryle walked over to the far table, pulled out a small sterilization kit, and dropped it in front of Marin. You're going to remove the implants. That's a violation of, I'll take the blame, Ryle said. File it under emergency protection protocol. I'll sign it myself. You're risking your rank. I'm not risking them. Marin looked between them. Then, after a long pause, nodded. I'll need 20 minutes. Ilara stayed beside the children while Ryle stepped out into the corridor. He leaned back against the wall, exhaling slowly, the weight of what they had just decided settling in his bones like dust. They hadn't just broken protocol. They had declared war on whatever system had decided these children were acceptable cargo. Ilara stepped out moments later, her voice soft. They were singing, in their sleep, a lullaby from Janir. Ryle looked up. That's 10 systems from here. Ilara nodded. They weren't taken from one place. They were collected. Ryle's hands clenched into fists. Then we find who's doing the collecting. And this time, they don't disappear. Chief Kelth arrived just after midday, wrapped in the weight of polished armor and bureaucratic authority. His boots clicked too loudly against the infirmary floor, as if announcing each step would make people forget he'd been too late. Ryle Kane stood waiting near the sealed entrance, arms crossed, spine straight. The children were behind that door. Quiet now. Healing. For the moment. Ilara Vess stood beside him, expression unreadable, but her fingers rested lightly on the hilt of her service blade, just enough to send a message. Kelth didn't smile. Commander Kane, he said, voice clipped. Lieutenant Vess, congratulations. You've caused a political incident before noon. We saved 3 lives, Ryle said flatly. If that's a problem, file a complaint. Kelth ignored him. You broke containment protocol. You obstructed station security. You interfered with lawful evidence handling. You initiated medical procedures without clearance. And I'd do it again, Ilara said calmly. Kelth turned to her, brow raised. I expected more discipline from an Astrian officer. She met his gaze. Then you've been listening to the wrong stories. Kelth exhaled slowly, adjusting the datapad in his hand. The children are now classified as high-priority custody transfers. They'll be moved to Central Station for evaluation and reassignment. No, Ryle said. Just that. No heat. No shout. Just finality. Kelth blinked. Excuse me? I'm invoking Emergency Protection Article 9, Direct Command Authority. They stay here, under my watch. That order requires Admiralty-level override. I have it. He reached into his coat and produced a data chip. Kelth scanned it. Color drained from his face. That's from Admiral Thorne. Correct, Ryle said. Signed 6 months ago in case this exact situation occurred. Kelth looked between them. You knew. Ilara stepped forward. We suspected. Now we know. Kelth's jaw tightened. Do you understand what you're getting involved in? We understand enough to know that if we walk away now, we're no better than the ones who boxed them, Ryle said. Silence stretched between them. Then Kelth turned. "This will not be contained." Ilara spoke softly. "Neither will the truth." He left without another word. Later that night, Ryle stood on the balcony overlooking Docking Bay 4. The stars above Proxima blinked faintly behind a veil of orbital haze. Below, cargo freighters drifted in and out, the same as always. Ilara joined him, 2 steaming cups in her hands. She passed him one. "They've stabilized," she said. He nodded. "They asked for you." He looked down at the cup, then out at the stars again. "Do you think we can protect them?" "I don't know," she said. "But I know this." She looked at him, eyes serious. "We already chose to." They stood in silence, side by side, the stars too distant to hear them, but somehow closer than ever. The lights in the infirmary dimmed just after second shift, mimicking dusk, though there was no real sky above Proxima Station. Outside, the docking corridors buzzed with trade traffic and muffled voices, but inside the medbay, all was still. Too still. Commander Ryle Kane paced slowly along the edge of the room. His presence was quiet but heavy, like a loaded rifle leaned against a wall. 3 beds were spaced evenly across the floor, each now occupied not by unknown victims but by names. Leary, the eldest, sat upright with her knees to her chest, eyes alert beneath a mess of pale green curls. Tala, younger but sharper, lay sideways, drawing invisible shapes across the air with her fingertip. Mira, the smallest, was asleep again, her hand still loosely curled around the corner of Ilara's coat. Ilara Vess sat beside her, her free hand gently brushing through the child's silver hair. "They're speaking again," she said softly. Ryle paused. "What language?" "Janiri root dialect. But there's blend, multiple systems, patterns like refugees, taken from different worlds." Ilara nodded. Ryle walked over and crouched beside Tala's bed. The girl froze at first, then slowly resumed her motions in the air. "What are you drawing?" he asked gently. Tala tilted her head, blinking once. "Stars." "Your stars?" he asked. She nodded. "They don't match here." Ilara leaned forward. "How do you remember them?" Tala hesitated, then tapped the side of her head. "We saw them in the dark." She said it so matter-of-factly it took Ryle a moment to realize what she meant. Not through a window, not in a story, but projected, forced, downloaded, like lessons fed into a machine. Ilara exhaled. They were trying to rewrite them. Riel stood slowly, rage simmering behind his calm. "We need to know who." He stepped out into the corridor. Ilara followed. Dr. Marin met them just outside the door, his face pale. "You'll want to see this," he said, holding up a scanning tablet. "I finished decrypting the residue data from the chips you had me pull." "What did you find?" Ryle asked. "Not just tracking protocols, message routing keys, transponders, tag codes used in long-range traffic signals." Ilara's eyes narrowed. "Slave trade codes?" Marin nodded grimly. "Buried under medical encryptions. Someone was moving them across systems under humanitarian classification." "Official convoys," Ryle said. "Military protected." "And worse," Marin added. "Some of these tags route back to active diplomatic channels, high-level signatures. Someone isn't just ignoring this. Someone built this." Ilara's voice dropped. 17 children. That's what they remember. 17 total. We have 3. Silence fell. Then Riel spoke. "We find the others." Ilara met his eyes. "Even if it means burning our own badge to do it?" Ryle's voice didn't waver. "Especially then." They turned back toward the infirmary, toward 3 children who'd been boxed and shipped like freight, who still whispered in their sleep. And somewhere out in the stars, 14 more waited in silence, hoping someone would hear. The sirens didn't howl. They clicked. A low, mechanical rhythm that pulsed through the metal bones of Proxima Station like a warning too tired to scream. Commander Ryle Kane was already running by the second click. Ilara Vess was 2 steps behind him, coat flaring as her boots pounded across the upper corridor. The infirmary door was wide open. Inside, empty beds, no children. Only overturned monitors, a trail of smeared footprints, and the metallic scent of sterilized panic. A maintenance tech stood trembling in the corner, his tablet shattered on the floor. Ryle grabbed him by the collar. "What happened?" They came from medical transport," the man stammered. "Had clearance codes, real ones, not forged. Just walked in and took them." Ilara's voice was ice. "How long ago?" 7 minutes, the tech choked out. That was too long. Ryle turned and ran. The hangar bay was already in chaos. A light freighter sat idling near the outer lock, its thrusters warming. Security staff were nowhere in sight. A few workers stood frozen at a distance, watching but saying nothing. The boarding ramp hissed shut just as Ryle reached the deck. He didn't slow down. He launched himself forward and landed hard on the ramp just before it lifted, jamming a stun baton into the side panel. Sparks flew. The ramp stopped moving. Ilara vaulted beside him a heartbeat later, blade drawn, her eyes blazing with fury beneath her calm exterior. They stormed the hold. Inside, 2 masked figures turned, one holding Mira under his arm like she was cargo, not a child. Leary and Tala huddled behind stacked crates, wide-eyed. Ryle didn't speak. He just moved. The first blow cracked the closer man's wrist. The second sent him into a bulkhead. Ilara moved like lightning, her blade disarming the second assailant before he could draw, then slicing through the collar of his armor with surgical precision. The third man had a gun. He aimed it at Mira. Ryle stepped in front, took the shot. His armor absorbed most of it, but the impact drove him to his knees. Mira screamed. Ilara didn't scream. She ended it. The shot man slumped to the floor, unconscious. Ryle groaned and rolled over. "Still breathing," he muttered. "Good," Ilara said. "You're going to need it." She gathered the children quickly, checking each one with practiced hands. They were shaken, but alive. Hours later, the assailants were in lockup. Their ship impounded. The codes they used? Verified, official, from inside Proxima Command. Ryle stood outside the holding cells, bruised and silent, eyes locked on the screen. Ilara stood beside him, arms crossed. They tried to erase them. Again. "They failed," Ryle said. "Not for lack of help." He looked at her. "You still with me?" She nodded. "All the way." Behind them, Leary watched quietly through the medbay window, her hand pressed against the glass. And in her eyes, for the first time since the box, there was something new. Not fear, not silence. A flicker of fire. Emerald Colony was not on any tourist route. An old mining settlement buried in the shadows of Astera's 4th moon, it had long since stopped producing real ore. What it produced now was silence, enough of it to hide 1,000 sins. Ryle and Ilara landed under cover of a salvage escort pretext, their ship tagged with a routine inspection clearance. It was barely enough to slip past local airspace control, but this mission was already running on borrowed time and thinner trust. They moved fast through the loading decks dressed like traders, weapons hidden beneath dull cloaks. No one questioned their arrival. No one ever did here. Emerald had learned not to ask. Ilara's voice was quiet in Ryle's calm. "Signal's faint, but the biometric pings match Leary's earlier readings. The others are here, somewhere inside the central processing wing." Ryle's jaw tightened. "Then we go get them." Inside the complex, the corridors were dim and too clean, like someone kept polishing away guilt. Surveillance drones buzzed overhead, silent and predatory. Beyond the reinforced doors, they found them, children, dozens, seated in rows on metal benches, tagged, tracked, expressionless. They weren't in cells. They were being sorted. The station labeled them by size, origin, genetic stability. A language of inventory, not identity. Above their heads, a massive screen flickered with auction codes. Ilara's hands clenched into fists. "We were too late." "No," Ryle said. "Not yet." They slipped behind a processing console, tapped into the control system. Ryle's fingers danced across the interface, accessing the transmission queue. "We leak this now," he whispered. And the whole galaxy sees it. Ilara paused. And if we don't? They disappear forever. She nodded once. Do it. Ryle hit send. Alarms triggered instantly, not from his action, but from the breach alert someone else had tripped. They'd been expected. The doors slammed shut. Lights turned blood red. And from the far end of the chamber, guards began to flood in, real ones this time. Armed, coordinated. Ryle drew his rifle. Ilara stepped forward, shielding the children. Fallback point? Maintenance shaft behind central console, Ryle said, but we have to hold them off first. The first shot came fast. Ryle returned fire. Ilara moved like a blade between heartbeats, stunning 2 guards before they could raise their weapons. But more kept coming. Too many. And then? The roof above the far platform buckled, and from the shadows, miners began to descend. Emerald workers. Covered in dust, wielding tools not meant for combat but held like weapons anyway. One stepped forward, an older man with one eye and a shoulder brace. We heard the feed, he said. You came unarmed, Ryle said, breathless. The man smiled. Didn't need arms? We brought presents. Together, they pushed the guards back, not with fire, but with refusal. When the last shot fell silent, the children were gone, led out through the maintenance shaft, protected by workers who had chosen to be more than witnesses. Ryle slumped against the wall, breathing hard. Ilara knelt beside a boy no older than 7, cutting the ID band from his wrist. The boy blinked up at her. Are you my people now? Ilara didn't speak. She just nodded. And that was enough. The skies above Proxima Station were unusually clear. No trade traffic, no political convoys. Only one ship, sleek, obsidian-lined, and silent, piercing the atmosphere like a blade, returned to its sheath. Admiral Thorne had arrived. Ryle Kane stood on the command platform as the ship docked, his shoulders squared beneath the weight of days without sleep. Ilara stood beside him, flanked by 6 rescued children now under full protection status. They weren't in uniform. They weren't guarded. They were visible. Admiral Thorne exited her ship with quiet fury. No grand retinue, no ceremony, just her eyes, sharp, gray, and burning with truths long suspected but never spoken. You went off mission, she said to Ryle without pause. I went into mission, he replied calmly. The one no one else would touch. She looked past him to the children. They stared back, silent, their presence louder than any argument he could make. Thorne nodded once. Good. Behind her, 4 other officers stepped out, dragging a figure in diplomat robes, his cuffs bound in black steel. Ambassador Voren Reth. Still pristine, still smiling, until he saw Ilara. I see the mutiny has taken root, he said smoothly. Ilara didn't blink. You sold them like livestock. They were liabilities, Voren replied. Expensive, unclaimed. Easier to move than to rehabilitate. Ryle stepped forward. 17 lives you trafficked, that we know of. Voren scoffed. And you'd let your precious children live in hunger and shadows just to keep them from those who would give them purpose? They don't need purpose, Ilara said coldly. They need safety. Admiral Thorne didn't speak. She simply pressed the datapad in her hand. A broadcast triggered. Across Proxima, every screen lit up with footage of Emerald Colony, of smuggling ships, of children sorted by number, of guards dragging Mira by the arm. And then? The final clip, Ryle, giving his authorization to protect. Ilara, pulling off her badge to block a weapon from striking Leary. And the children, just standing there, refusing to be erased. The galaxy watched in silence. Voran's smile faded. Thorne turned to her guards. Take him to Sol Tribunal. No shield, no silence. They obeyed, and with that, power shifted. Later, in the med bay, Ilara sat quietly as a nurse examined the bruises along her ribs. She winced once, then froze as the scanner blinked. Is something wrong? She asked. The nurse's eyes widened. No, he whispered. Not wrong, just unexpected. He turned the screen. Congratulations, you're pregnant. Ilara stared. Ryle walked in just as her breath caught. She looked at him, speechless. He stepped closer. And then, for the first time since all of it began, Ilara Vess smiled. Not for duty, not for justice, but because something new had begun. Something neither of them thought possible. Life. Real life, between them. Born not from power or war or pain, but from choosing each other. And in the corridor beyond, Leary danced with Mira beneath the artificial light of a growing dawn. 3 years later, the wind on Proxima smelled like rain. Not real rain, of course. The atmosphere was still too thin for natural weather. But the terraforming towers had finally done their work. The moisture clung to every leaf, shimmered on rooftops, and drifted through the colony like a whisper of something long believed impossible. Ryle Kane stood barefoot on the back deck of a modest home near the southern ridge, holding a mug of lukewarm tea and watching 4 children chase each other through a patch of grass that hadn't existed the year before. Leary darted between solar panels, laughing, while Mira stumbled behind her in oversized boots. Tala climbed up the side of the water tank, ignoring every rule ever written. And in the middle of it all, the smallest of them, his son, sat in the dirt, humming softly as he made a nest out of polished stones and shredded cloth. His skin was half Astrian pale, half human warmth. His eyes were Ilara's. Ryle smiled. Inside the house, Ilara leaned against the frame of the open doorway, arms folded, scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. Her belly had grown heavy again. Life, once more, on its way. Her expression was calm. Watching. Listening. "You still drink that awful tea?" she asked. Ryle shrugged. "It keeps me grounded," Ilara chuckled. "We're already grounded. No starships, no firefights, just chores and stories." "And grass," he added. They stood in silence for a moment. Ilara turned toward him. "Did you ever think this would be home?" He looked at the children again. "Number? But I think it always could have been." From the distance, Leary called out, "Mama, Mira's eating a bug again." Ilara groaned and walked inside. Ryle didn't move. He just breathed. The galaxy had changed. The ring had been broken. The smuggling routes shut down. New protocols now tracked migrant children across systems with care, not control. And the First Drop Initiative, named quietly by Ciela, who now taught on Mir Station, had become a network of shelters, safe routes, and, most of all, choices. But none of it had started with councils or laws. It had started with them. 2 officers who had broken orders. 3 children who had survived what they were never meant to. And a love that refused to ask permission. That night, as the artificial moons rose above Proxima, Ryle sat at the edge of the garden. His son climbed into his lap, curling up like a question with no wrong answer. "Dad," the boy said, blinking up at him, "why do we have so many names in this family?" Ryle smiled. "Because not all families start the same way. But the good ones? They make space for everyone." The boy yawned. And somewhere, not far from that quiet house, a transmitter blinked gently in the dark. The old feed still looped. The one with the freighter. The children. The first risk. The one where 2 officers chose not to look away. Some families are born in safety. Others are forged in the fire of what the world tries to ignore. Would you break the rules to protect someone no one else saw? Would you build a future from the children everyone forgot? Share your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the most radical thing you can do is open your door and say you belong here.